Okay. Hi, everybody. So I'm Larissa Babak. I am the User Engagement Manager for Knowledge Commons. So whenever I introduce myself to people, and probably some of you in this room, I usually say that my work balances community outreach and instructional design or user support. This project of launching a bunch of docs and documentation, as well as the outreach pieces of social media and a blog post, encompassed all of those pieces of the work that I do. So I'm going to do a very quick overview of what that looked like. So beginning in about May of 2024, Bonnie and I looked to a lot of the documentation that was already existing around Invenio RDM to create that foundation that users would interact with when they started to be integrating themselves into our new repository. And so we were lucky enough to meet with the team at Northwestern, who was also working on a repository in Invenio called Prism for their medical school. They had already, as their team at the library had worked through getting that launched, had created some documentation around it. And so Bonnie and I looked at that, and it was a good model to get started with. And then also in Knowledge Commons, we have our support website, which is at support.hcommons.org. That's where we have all of our user guides that we have on how to create a group and how to update your profile. And we looked at what we had for core already and said, okay, some of these guides that we have, they just need to be tweaked a little bit to have the new system integrated. And some of the features, as you saw from Bonnie's presentation, completely new for users, and so we needed to start from scratch. This screenshot, that it's really tiny, is the list of all the guides that we have for KCWorks at the moment. I know it's hard to read, so if you go to support.hcommons.org and click on KCWorks in the top nav menu, you can see and interact with those guides. So the creation process for the guides that we had to start from scratch with, in particular what I tend to do is when I'm testing the system to make sure things work, I will also go through and write down what I am doing step by step, because that's what you all do when you interact with a website, is you're going to be interacting with it step by step. And we were at a point of just testing the system to tell Ian what was working. In many cases, most things were working. There were a few things that needed to be also from testing he had to go in and fix. But for me, it started with just screenshotting pages as I was going, writing down the instructions. What I did is I put those support pages in Google Docs to start with the screenshots, and then one of the students that I work with, who's an XA student here at MSU, Morgan Myers, I told her to take those Google Docs, put them in the WordPress site, and because she's a student who does not do a lot of repository work, I told her that if she's catching things as she's going that were not correct or did not make sense to her as someone who is a new user who's never been in core, then that means that they probably won't make sense to most people that have not used it before. And so she was then able to get those things up in WordPress and make sure they had alt text there and all that. A lot of the questions that we knew were the things that people will always want to know when they're in a new system. For example, we know that a lot of people who had used core in the past would want to know what happened with their metadata or what happened with their work. Can they still access it? One of the big changes that now users can edit. So we already were anticipating that once things were migrated, there will be questions there. At the same time, you have to find a balance between anticipating this is what people are going to ask, and then also the fact that once everyone is out in the world and using the system, they're going to either find bugs or they're going to just have new use cases that they're going to want to have there. And so accepting that even though we did as much planning and creating documentation beforehand, there will always be a certain level of there's going to be follow-up that users are going to ask about. And then also prior to launch on the more outreach side, we did a few social media posts. At the time we were on X, Mastodon, and LinkedIn. Now we're not using X anymore, but just to let people know, we're launching this new repository. This is really exciting. Things are going to happen there. And also there was a slight window of downtime as that final migration took place. So warning people, there will be a few hours where things will not be working, but then once it's back, we will have this shiny new repository. I'm going to go really fast through this, but this is just an example guide with some screenshots. And as I said, if you go to that support website, you can look at that more closer and interact with it. So then once launch had actually happened at the end of October, the main piece of user communication that we did was a blog post that is on our About site, and that is news@hcommons.org, to let users know we've officially launched public beta, and here are some FAQs that, again, we anticipated people would know. In particular, in the space of what is a beta, because as a beta launch, there are still things that need to be worked through, so people would not panic as soon as they noticed something was wrong with the record or whatnot. And then also, as I already kind of mentioned, letting people know that all of their work that they had added to core in the past would still be accessible in Caseyworks. They didn't have to make any changes there. And then as a way of getting that blog post more visibility, we shared that on social media. And throughout the week, we had a few other posts where we linked to the support guides, had some little tidbits on, oh, guess what? You can now edit your metadata and whatnot, so to get people excited and to let them know what was going on. So after launch had happened a few weeks later, our team did hour-long webinars to introduce the Caseyworks system to the public. And so we held them twice in the week of November 13th, and we had them at different times to accommodate as many people as possible. And what we did is that 4 members of the team, myself, Bonnie, Ian, and Kathleen Fitzpatrick, our project director, all were in the webinar. Each of us took about a 10-minute section to introduce something to our users. So Kathleen did a little bit of history. Bonnie talked about collections and metadata. Ian did a tour of the system to show how it works and how to do an upload and stuff. And then I talked about the community aspects of how you can stay in touch with us. And so it worked out really well because then each of us did not have the pressure of doing a huge presentation, but we each got to talk about what was our specialty. And then we had the recording of that published on YouTube in 2 formats. One as the full thing for those that could not attend, and then one that was just a segment of Ian's portion where he did the tour, so that if somebody wants to watch the tutorial of how to upload, they could just skip directly to that part. Also added the slides to Caseyworks, practicing what we preach, making sure that people could access the resources there. On the roadmap for the future, now that we are in the post-launch period, we are planning to incorporate some more video content within the guides that we have. We have that great tour from Ian, but we also want to make sure there are some shorter snippets, and that's something we're looking at in the next few months to add to. As I mentioned, documentation is always sort of a work in progress. Subject headings being one that in the last few weeks we've had more user questions about how those work, and so then we will be adding more pages to that support site. And then in addition, more workshops and webinars in order to have opportunities to talk about what we do, to also get people through that barrier of feeling maybe overwhelmed by a repository and feel more comfortable with adding things and sharing their work. So I think that is it for me. Yes, it is. So I'm gonna skip.